Okay, so have you ever, like, completely butchered a phrase in another
Oh,
language?
it's absolutely. It's inevitable, right?
Because I was picturing, like, trying to order a coffee in, let's say, Brazil, and instead of, what is it, cafezinho, I end up requesting a singing armadillo. Just a total word fumble.
Oh, that's fantastic. A singing armadillo. That's a new one.
Yeah,
But you've hit on something that's so central to language learning, those moments of hilarious miscommunication.
totally. Which is why I'm really curious to dig into this Master English Fast program. It seems like they really get the whole, like, emotional side of learning a language.
Yeah, they seem very focused on the motivational aspect, which I have to say, from a purely psychological standpoint, is pretty smart.
How so?
Well, they kind of start by giving you this little pep talk, getting you pumped up to tackle English grammar. And studies actually show that approaching learning with a positive attitude can really impact your progress.
Interesting. So it's like they're setting you up for success from the get-go by tapping into that whole mind over matter thing.
Exactly. Enthusiasm can be contagious, even through a podcast. But don't worry, they don't just leave you hanging with good vibes and positive affirmations. They actually get into some pretty practical advice, too. Like, one thing that really struck me was the sheer variety of language learning apps they recommend.
Oh, yeah. Because I feel like everyone has their favorite app, but they always seem to recommend the same couple of ones.
Right. But these guys, they really branch out. Like, take Duolingo, for example. It's become pretty popular, and for good reason, they've gamified the whole language learning process.
Oh, I'm all about Duolingo.
Hmm.
That whole point system and the little cartoon owl, it totally sucked me in.
See? It works. Our brains just love a little positive reinforcement. And for those who prefer a more, shall we say, traditional approach, there's always Babbel.
Babbel, yeah. I haven't used that one myself, but I've heard good things. What's their angle?
They're very focused on practical conversational skills. So if you're planning a trip soon and need to know how to, say, navigate a restaurant menu or ask for directions, Babbel could be your new best friend.
So it's all about getting you speaking confidently in real-life situations, which, let's be real, is the ultimate goal, right?
Exactly. Although we don't want to forget about those visual learners out there. And that's where Memrise comes in. They use these really quirky and memorable images and videos to help cement new vocabulary.
Oh, memorize, right. It's like they've tapped into the power of mnemonics or something, creating these little mental hooks to help you remember.
Exactly. And I love how Master English Fast acknowledges that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to language learning. They're all about finding what clicks with your individual brain.
Which makes total sense, because we all learn differently.
Absolutely. And speaking of different approaches, they're also big proponents of using YouTube as a learning tool.
Oh, for sure. YouTube can be a gold mine for language learners, but there's also a ton of, well, let's just say, not so helpful content out there.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to get lost in the abyss of cat videos and makeup tutorials, but Master English Fast actually highlights some real gems, channels that are both entertaining and educational. Like, have you ever heard of English Addict with Mr. Duncan?
English Addict with Mr. Duncan. The name rings a bell, but I can't quite place it.
Well, let me tell you, this guy is fantastic, especially if grammar usually makes your eyes glaze over.
Okay, now you've got my attention. A grammar guru who's actually engaging. Tell me more.
Let's just say he manages to make learning about sentence structure surprisingly fun.
All right, I'm sold. I'll have to check him out. But I also imagine there are some listeners out there thinking, okay, that's great, but what about good old-fashioned books? Are those still relevant in the age of apps and YouTube?
That's a great question. And you know what? The podcast actually addresses that head on. They actually encourage people to not discount the power of reading, even suggesting children's books as a starting point.
Wait, go back. Children's books. Now, I'm intrigued, but how does that work? Explain it to me like I'm 5.
Think about it. Children's books use simple, repetitive language, which is actually incredibly effective for language acquisition.
Oh, that's so clever. It's like easing yourself into the flow of the language without even realizing it. Okay, so we've got apps, YouTube, books. It's like they've created this whole language learning buffet.
They really have. And they don't stop there. They also delve into the idea of immersion, which, let's be honest, can sometimes feel a bit overwhelming, like you need to book a one-way ticket to London or something.
Right, like not all of us can just pack up and move to an English-speaking country.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. Master English Fast breaks down immersion into manageable everyday actions. It's not about upending your life, it's about shifting your mindset and your media consumption. They even suggest something as simple as changing your phone's language settings to English.
Wait, really? That's brilliant. It's like self-learning happening in the background of your daily routine.
Precisely. They're all about transforming those passive moments into opportunities for growth. And speaking of passive learning, they're big proponents of audiobooks. Imagine yourself listening to, say, Pride and Prejudice while you're cooking dinner or folding laundry.
Okay, you had me at Pride and Prejudice. But what about choosing the right books, especially for language learners? Where do you even begin?
Well, that's where graded readers come in handy. They're specifically designed for language learners.
Graded readers.
Yeah, so they take like classic books and stuff, but they rewrite them using simplified language.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and the vocabulary and the grammar are all tailored to different proficiency levels, so you don't have to
I see.
wade through a dense novel.
So it's kind of like choosing your reading level on Duolingo,
Yeah,
but for actual books.
exactly.
Just a really cool idea.
Yeah, it takes all the guesswork out of it.
Yeah.
You're not going to get completely lost and discouraged.
Right, because you're setting yourself up for success.
Exactly. And that actually segues nicely into another point that the podcast makes, which is the importance of speaking.
Speaking, oh yeah, because I was just thinking, as much as I love reading, I feel like I really learn best when I'm actually speaking English.
You and me both.
Right.
It's one thing to understand things in your head,
Right.
but to actually be able to produce the language,
Yes.
that's where the real magic happens.
Totally. Because it's like all those times I've practiced conversations in my head.
Oh, yeah.
Or even talk to myself out loud and don't judge.
Not judging at all.
Is that actually helping me or am I just,
You're not alone, trust me. That's a very common thing.
quite
It's called private speech.
private speech? Okay, so there's a term for it.
There's a term for it, so you're not crazy.
All right, good to know.
And it's actually a really important part of cognitive development.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So when you talk to yourself, your brain is basically processing information, internalizing new concepts.
So I should just embrace my inner monologue then.
Exactly.
All right, I can get behind that.
But I totally get it. Sometimes you want to branch out.
Yes, branch out from the self-talk.
Exactly. And find some real life conversation partners.
Right, because as much as I love chatting with myself, it's not quite the same as a real conversation.
Exactly. And the podcast actually gives a couple of suggestions for this.
Oh, really?
They talk about language exchange apps.
Language exchange apps, okay.
Yeah, like Tandem and HelloTalk are a couple of popular ones.
Okay.
And basically, you connect with native English speakers who want to learn your language.
Oh, that's cool. So it's like a win-win situation.
Exactly. You get to practice your English, they get to practice your native language, everyone benefits.
I love that. It's like having a built-in language partner.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it also adds a layer of accountability, I think, because, you're both working towards a common goal.
Right. You've got someone to hold you accountable.
Exactly. But one thing they do emphasize is the importance of setting realistic expectations.
Oh, right.
It's a two-way street.
Right. It's an exchange.
Yeah, it's not a free tutoring service.
Right. You're both there to learn and grow together.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But speaking of growth, one area I still really struggle with is grammar.
Grammar, yeah.
It could just feel so overwhelming
It
sometimes.
can be a lot, yeah.
Like all those rules and exceptions to the rules and then exceptions to the exceptions.
Tell me about it. It's a lot to keep straight.
It's like my brain just wants to shut down.
Right.
But the podcast, they have a really interesting take on grammar.
Oh. They actually advise not getting too bogged down in the rules right away.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
So don't stress about memorizing every single grammar rule before you even start speaking.
Exactly.
Huh. That's kind of freeing.
Right. They say it's better to focus on common phrases first.
Common phrases. Okay.
Yeah, get a feel for how the language actually works in context.
I see. So it's more about immersion and just kind of absorbing the patterns naturally.
Exactly. They compare it to learning to cook.
Learning to cook.
Okay, I'm listening. You wouldn't start by, memorizing the periodic table of elements, would you?
No, I guess not.
You'd start with recipes, right? You'd experiment. You'd see how different ingredients work together.
Oh, okay. I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So instead of getting bogged down in the technicalities, just jump in and start experimenting with the language.
Exactly.
And trust that the grammar rules will kind of reveal themselves along the way.
Exactly.
That makes so much more sense than trying to, memorize verb conjugations from a textbook.
Right. It's about understanding the language organically.
Yeah, organically. I like that. Okay, so we've got grammar sort of demystified, but what about vocabulary? That's a big one.
Vocabulary, yeah, that's a biggie. And it can feel really daunting.
Daunting is a good word for it. Because it's like, where do you even begin? There's so many words.
There are, it's true. But the podcast has a really cool suggestion for this, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with technology.
Oh, really? So they're bringing it back to the apps.
Exactly. They're big fans of using flashcards.
Flashcards, okay.
Yeah, but not just any flashcards. They recommend using apps like Anki or Quizlet.
Anki, Quizlet, got it. I've heard of those, but haven't really used them.
Well, these apps are great because they use this technique called spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition. Now that I haven't heard of.
Okay, so imagine this. You're learning a new word, right?
Okay.
And instead of just like writing it down and hoping for the best spaced repetition, it basically schedules when you're going to see that word again.
Oh, interesting. So it's kind of like setting reminders for your brain.
Exactly. It's like a little nudge to your memory.
That's really cool.
And the spacing is strategic.
Strategic. How so?
So you'll see the word more frequently at first.
Okay.
And then as you start to remember it better, the intervals get longer.
Oh, that's so smart. So it's
Oh.
like you're gradually training your brain to hold on to that information long term.
Exactly. It's like a workout routine for your vocabulary.
I love that. Instead of lifting weights, I'm lifting words.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here, from apps to YouTube channels to good old-fashioned books and even like tricking our phones into becoming language tutors.
It's like we've assembled this incredible toolkit for English learners.
We really have. But I have to admit, I'm also feeling a little, I don't know, overwhelmed. Like, where do I even begin with all this?
I totally get it. It's like having a million puzzle pieces, but not knowing where to start putting them together.
Exactly. It's that paralyzed by choice feeling.
Right. And I think that's why the podcast's emphasis on self-awareness really resonated with me.
Self-awareness, how so?
Well, they really drive home the point that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to language learning. It's about figuring out what works best for you.
So instead of trying to do everything at once, maybe it's about choosing one or two things that really click with your learning style.
Exactly. Don't feel like you have to conquer every app and technique at once. Pick something, start small, and build momentum from there.
Okay, that feels much more manageable. And it's a good reminder that even small, consistent efforts can add up over time.
Absolutely. It's a marathon, not a sprint, as they say. Like, even just dedicating 15 minutes a day to chatting on a language exchange app can make a huge difference.
Oh, for sure. It's all about those small, consistent steps forward. It's progress, not perfection. Right.
Exactly. And speaking of progress, I think this is a perfect segue into the podcast's final message, which is all about patience and self-compassion.
Oh, yes. Because it's so easy to get discouraged if you don't sound like a native speaker overnight.
Totally. But remember, everyone makes mistakes when they're learning a new language. It's part of the process.
It really is. Like, I still cringe when I think about my singing armadillo incident.
But hey, at least it's a memorable story, right?
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. But you're right. It's all about embracing those mistakes as learning opportunities.
Exactly. And having fun with the journey. Because at the end of the day, learning a new language should be an adventure.
It really should be. Well, I have to say, I'm feeling much more inspired and a lot less intimidated about my English learning journey now. Thanks so much for taking this deep dive with me.
My pleasure. It's been a really insightful conversation.
And to all our listeners out there, we hope you've picked up some valuable tips and tricks to supercharge your English learning. Remember, every conversation, every book, every song, it's all an opportunity to grow and expand your world. Until next time, happy learning.